Welcome to the YouTube channel for Global Environmental Politics. I'm Kate Neville, an associate professor of environmental politics at the University of Toronto and one of the journal's associate editors. I'm delighted to be joined by our guest today, Dr. Paul Steinberg, who is a professor of political science and environmental policy at Harvey Mudd College in California, where he holds the Malcolm Lewis Chair of Sustainability and Society and directs the Social Rules Project. Dr. Steinberg has written 3 books: Who Rules the Earth, Comparative Environmental Politics, and Environmental Leadership in Developing Countries. And he's written many articles as well, including one that was just published in Global Environmental Politics in the November 2024 issue. So, Paul, we're meeting today while you are in the midst of coping with devastating wildfires and storms across Southern California. And I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. In many ways, these conditions that you're facing at home and among your neighbors reflect the urgency of addressing climate change, and also the sense that we're up against catastrophic forces that we cannot change. So, the article that we're discussing today, From Apocalypse to Empowerment, Reframing Climate Action, seems to me perhaps more important than ever. So, if I have this kind of summarized in a way that you agree with, in your paper, you argue that we need to change how climate action is framed. So I'd like to ask you, what is the current dominant framing for climate action, and why do you find it troubling? What is the alternative that you propose?
Well, thanks for welcoming me into this format, Kate. I think that is a very fair summary of the article. And basically, the idea is anyone who's been involved in the environmental movement or even just reading newspapers for a long enough time can appreciate that one of the dominant narratives is that of apocalypse, and the notion that the future will be worse than the present, and that it is one that is going to be associated with cataclysm. And those who've studied this more methodically have found that the predominant version of apocalypse that we're exposed to in public media is one that we do not have control over. Now, I've spoken with a colleague, my colleague Erica Dyson at Harvey Mudd is a religious studies professor, and she teaches a class on apocalypse. And I asked her about this, and she said, "Oh, the environmental apocalypse seems to get it all wrong, because at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the world comes to an end, but then it's followed by something better afterward." She said the environmental apocalypse doesn't even have any such promise. And so the critique, the essence of this article is not in any way to deny the seriousness of climate change and what people are going through. As you noted, that here in Los Angeles, right now in 2025, we've had the largest wildfires anyone can remember in this area. Thousands of homes burned. 20 feet from me, my biggest tree in my front yard is now across the path, and I haven't yet tried to clear it. We had winds with gusts of up to 100 miles an hour coming through. So the problems are very real. But my concern is that when we look at it through the framework of apocalypse, we are missing all kinds of opportunities to inspire people to get involved in politics for the long term. And that requires an alternative frame, which is one example of which would be empowerment. And so that's what I'm trying to elaborate in this particular article.
Thanks for that, Paul. I'd like to sort of ask you to elaborate even further on that concept of empowerment. So, in that idea that an empowerment frame can help us sustain collective action over time, this kind of participation in movements towards this sort of future that maybe doesn't look as dismal, that perhaps isn't an after the world ending, but it's sort of alternative pathway that we could develop. I wonder if you could say more about this concept of power that leads to this empowerment frame. What is it that people are being empowered to do, or what is it that allows people to feel a capacity for that ongoing action or a motivation to continue participating?
Excellent. So there are a couple of pieces of this. I mean, first of all, let's start with the concept of power. So the predominant notion of power in political science is to have power over others. And this was famously articulated by Robert Dahl, and even critiques of Dahl's definition of power, which had to do with, A has power over B to the extent that A can get B to do something that A wants. Um, Even the critiques of that have focused on different modes of power over others, whether it's the power to set an agenda and decide which issues are on the agenda and off the agenda, or even the power to affect others' desires. All of this is power over others, but there's a broader conception of power that one finds in fields like community psychology and applied social work, which is power to. And actually, the Latin root of this word has much more to do with power to. And so it's secondary whether one uses this to control others or not. But power to is the fundamental concept that I return to in this article. Um, and the distinction matters because if we just focus on power over others, we're going to lose sight of a lot of opportunities for win-win solutions, for collaboration and the like. And of course, power over is central to the Marxist tradition that plays an important role in many different areas of environmental studies, like political ecology, and has absolutely revealed very important dynamics that we need to be aware of, structural inequalities, so that it's not just a rose-colored glasses, hey, we can have win-win solutions to make everything better. So we need both. But fundamental to this empowerment concept is power as capacity. So empowerment, as I define it, is, and there are a few parts of this. So I'll read it through, and then I'll sort of back up a little bit to talk about why I use this particular definition. So empowerment is anything that increases the motivation and ability of individuals or communities to identify and fulfill goals over the long term and across multiple issues. Okay. And the reason why I focus on long-term and multiple issues is if we are going to inspire people to get involved in addressing climate change, this is political change is a long-term process. Those who study policy change know that, I mean, Paul Sabatier used to say, if you're looking at less than 10 years, don't even talk to me about whether change has occurred. And actually, it was Sabatier who challenged Eleanor Ostrom to go back and look at the results of her PhD research with water management in Southern California to see if they were still enduring. And indeed they were. So long-term is fundamental to the notion of social change. And are we going to inspire people to get involved in social movements with fear, with messages of fear and doom? The psychology research suggests the answer is no. You can get someone to maybe show up for a protest or to be concerned for a period of time, but it's not adequate to sustain. So long-term is an important part of this. And I say across multiple issues. Why? Because autonomy is an important part of empowerment as well. Some years ago, when I was involved in this project called the Social Rules Project that you mentioned when I first launched this, and it was basically an animated film and video game and social media associated with my book, Who Rules the Earth? And there's a section on a website where I wanted to be able to point people to resources for activism. And I was interested to know who provides in the US training for how to be an activist. And the answer is no one. So I made calls all across the country to every activist institute you could imagine. People will provide training for their specific issue, right? And that's true of unions. That's true of NGOs. You can get training on how to mobilize around this particular grassroots, say, water access issue in this city. But I was unable to find an organization that actually provides people training to do, heaven forbid, to pursue political goals of their own volition, right? And so empowerment entails giving somebody the capacity to identify what they want to do and to fulfill those goals. And the reason why this, backing up for a moment, the reason why this is so important is I believe it's crucial to see activists as something more than just foot soldiers, sort of means to an end of achieving mitigation of climate change and its effects, but rather the well-being of participants is the goal alongside the long-term climate goal. so that if we make participants better off, that that is an empowerment frame. So where an empowerment frame matters is in our decisions as to how we design our campaigns, how we design our classroom curricula, how we think about public policies. The goal should not just be reducing CO2 in the atmosphere or mitigating the effects of fires, but actually making in the near term the participants better off. And that's what's intended with this framework overall.
That's really helpful, Paul, and I appreciate thinking about the temporal and the issue area dimensions of this proposal and this pathway that we might take up in the kind of climate sphere. I wonder, in your paper, you talk, for example, about the need for critical awareness of structural conditions as part of that work. So, kind of tying that idea of participant well-being to being able to adequately and accurately understand the structural conditions that are being operated under. This to me resonates with that project that you discuss that comes out of your book, Who Rules the World: How Social Rules Shape Our Planet and Our Lives. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how that kind of awareness of structural conditions and these social rules that shape our lives led you to think about what empowerment might mean in this paper. Um, and in part, I ask that because of the effects on individuals. Often these structural conditions feel quite immovable. Does a critical awareness of that lead to some of the actions that you've been fostering in the social rules project for how those rules, those underpinning structures might be shifted?
Yeah, I think that's a really important connection that you're drawing, Kate, between essentially institutional analysis and empowerment. So the Social Rules Project was designed to take this concept of institutions that is second nature to sort of macro social scientists, especially political scientists, and make it more intuitive for the general public. And so institutions are social rules. They're the rules we live by. Different disciplines define institutions somewhat distinctly, but just focusing on the simple case of rules and collections of rules that together form social structures. When we think about structural analysis, the great advantage, of course, and I think global environmental politics instructors are very comfortable with this idea. The advantage of structural analysis is to help people see beyond just the here and now, to identify what are the historical and social forces that are shaping the way that we live now. I mean, one way to think about it is the opposite of social order. So imagine that everybody is walking around with no social order whatsoever. We're all speaking gibberish to one another. We have no common languages. We have no habits. We have no norms. It's chaos, right? And then contrast that with the degree of order that we have. Why do we do the things we do? Why is it that we have professors and students in those roles? Why do those roles differ from one country to the next? Why is it that in the 1970s, if you're sitting in a college classroom, there were carcinogenic chemicals coming up from the carpet in the form of formaldehyde, the first chemical to be judged by the United Nations as absolutely a carcinogen, whereas today they're gone. Why is it that our lighting is from one electrical source and not another? And to understand those social patterns, a crucial part of that is the rules. And the rules are the laws, the policies, the social norms, the contracts, and so forth. And so that project was trying to bring to light in a more kind of intuitive way, and with the help of a lot of artists doing the film and so forth, to make that more intuitive. And where empowerment comes in is we need to not only understand the social structures that are shaping our world, we also need to understand how that changes. Because structure implies stability, but change also implies stability. Because we don't just want marriage equality for a week, right? We don't just want clean water for a few months. Social change requires a new type of stability. So to get away from the old arrangement is just the first part of the process. Then you need to restructuralize, institutionalize, right? And you'll hear a lot of people from the protest movements in the 1960s saying we didn't institutionalize enough, right? There was this great moment of enthusiasm and some changes, obviously, but didn't institutionalize enough. So where empowerment comes into all of this is to appreciate that social change is not only possible, Social change is pervasive. It's happening all the time. The question is who's involved in social change, right? Very few people understand that from the time that the climate treaty was signed in 1992 until today, global extreme poverty has been reduced by 2/3. Like we don't hear a lot of that in our classrooms. Like how did that change come about? And so we have to be aware of the changes that are occurring in our community and understand something of the mechanisms of change, of how institutional change occurs. And I think that's a really important part of the empowerment task is to help students understand, yes, there are corporate lobbyists that are preventing certain bills from getting through Congress. And yes, there are communities that have been designed in a certain way that the poor are exposed to more air pollution than are the wealthy and so forth. But it's precisely that historical perspective, standing back a little bit and looking at 20, 30, 40 years, that can help us to appreciate just how radically things have shifted over time and it's ongoing. And so I think that's a very important part of the empowerment project is to help students and citizens understand the pervasiveness of social change and how it works.
Paul, thanks for that, especially reinforcing these themes of temporality and working across issue areas. I think that your answer to that really helps illuminate some of those dynamics for me in ways that tie these projects together. I wonder, because one of the things I appreciate so much about your paper is how vivid it is at illustrating these concepts. And we briefly spoke a few minutes before we started this interview about some of the writing choices that you made to draw those examples out. And I wonder if you could say something about how you experienced the writing of this paper, as well as the ideas that sort of motivated it and that generated it. But, what is it that you chose to do in this writing, and why did you make some of those choices around those illustrative examples?
Good. Well, one example early in the article is a sort of hypothetical scenario that a lot of people can relate to. And so I briefly trace the example of a young woman who soon after graduating from college goes to take her first environmental job. And she is, instead of being placed in a position of influence within that organization, even though she has all these skills, has just taken all these environmental classes, is probably a good public speaker, pretty good writer, she's placed in a cubicle somewhere off to the side where she's been tasked with data analysis. She's not invited to any of the meetings where important decisions are being made. She's a pretty good writer, but others in the organization are better. They've been doing it for 20 years. And so her reports sort of go to others who are going to do the final writing. The results of this report are going to be shared with a city council person, perhaps, or with a national policymaker. She's not invited to those meetings either. Over time, even though she was quite well connected in college, her social connections begin to wither. Her confidence starts to reduce. She's wondering if activism is really all that it's made up to be, not just in that organization, but generally. So life choices about, do I want to be an engaged citizen? And so this scenario that I use in the writing is intended to describe the opposite of empowerment. What does disempowerment look like? And I know, having taught thousands of students, I know that this is not an unusual scenario. And actually, the research shows that it is quite common that people experience burnout, they experience disempowerment as participants in social movements. And the literature also shows that many people find the experience to be quite empowering, so life-changing. So somebody joins a movement or an organization out of just kind of a vague curiosity of getting involved in the peace movement or climate change or something of the like, and it completely transforms their sense of self. They come out of it with greater skills, greater resources, more confidence, a new sense of purpose in life. So there's a large literature suggesting that that's a common outcome as well. So the point here is that empowerment is a variable. And what this article is trying to do is encourage educators, non-governmental organizations, policymakers, social media leaders to think about how to tilt that variable toward empowerment. Participation in the climate movement does not make a person better off. It can make them better off, it can make them worse off by far. And so the question is, what do we do to try and tilt that in the right direction?
Oh, that's it's motivating, Paul, to hear you think about what can be done to change those conditions, that this is not just a function of the issue itself or the sort of seeming uh, apocalyptic trajectories that we are on, but something that could be shifted through very intentional institutional, organizational, and personal actions and decisions. Maybe drawing on that, you sort of spoke to this in that example of who you think might be able to take up this call to action. But I wonder if you can say a little bit more about why now? Why is this article so needed now, and whose hands do you hope it ends up in?
Hmm. Um, the primary audience for this article is the group that I call climate leaders. And I use the term fairly loosely as a broad category. But those who are in charge of designing the educational event and deciding who sits where, those who are in charge of designing the law and deciding whether there might be a provision in that law that requires cities to have real participation from their citizens in designing bicycle lanes, for example. And so those who are in charge of the quality of the participatory experience have decisions to make. Let me give an example that's not in the article. So I do a lot of bicycle advocacy at local levels. And wearing my bike advocate hat, one day we formed a new group here in Claremont called Claremont Streets for People, and we have a booth at a big fair, right? And there are a couple of students there who've joined, and there are a couple of the more experienced bicycle advocates who are more my age, right? And at one point, someone comes up to the booth, a member of the public comes by, and a young Asian American woman student is starting to explain what our group is about to this person. And she's doing a reasonably good job. I think it was probably the first time she had ever tried to articulate what the group is about. And maybe halfway into her second sentence, um, a colleague of mine, 6'2", good-looking, blonde, white man, takes over the conversation and perfectly articulates in the next three sentences what this group is about to this community member as the student sort of slinks back and lets him take over. Now, was the message delivered more effectively to that particular member of the public? In that instance, it was. We could talk about identity and homophily and that sort of thing. But yes, he did a better job of communicating it. So if the goal is social change now, get the message out as effectively as we can, fine, he did it. But meanwhile, the student has had the experience of disempowerment, of not having the opportunity to practice. Empower opportunities for everyday empowerment, as I call them, come up when, as professors, we have a guest speaker come to campus, perhaps a very prestigious person. Do we just arrange a meeting between that person and a couple of our favorite colleagues who would love to have dinner? Or might we invite a couple of students to that event as well? In the asking of questions in the classroom, experienced teachers have to develop the skill of noticing who is not participating as much. And might we say, let's hear from someone who hasn't spoken yet, right? So I think these opportunities for everyday empowerment are a really important part of the question. Um, I don't know if I addressed your question directly enough. However, you should feel free to steer it in that direction if I didn't do so adequately.
Paul, you did a wonderful job in expanding not just the article, but the experiences of empowerment that you're hoping to promote through this work. Not just the academic piece, which is a wonderful article to read, but also what are the actions it might spark? What are the ways it might change what we're doing? And I think that we are at our time. And so I would like to take this opportunity, Paul, to thank you for joining us today, for sharing your work with the Global Environmental Politics audience, both in the written form and now here online. So thanks to all our watchers, and be sure to go to the journal to find this terrific article. Paul, thank you.
It's my pleasure, Kate. Thank you so much for the opportunity.